Before starting the video, we need your help to keep the channel active with your subscription. Subscribe to the channel and help us continue bringing new videos. Subscribe to support us and help keep the channel alive. The P-39 Airacobra emerged from the Second World War as one of the most misunderstood fighters ever built. During the conflict, it carried a complex reputation, praised by Soviet pilots who flew it at low altitude with deadly effectiveness, criticized by British and American pilots who expected it to perform as a high-altitude interceptor, and remembered by historians as a machine whose potential was limited by strategic decisions and technical priorities. But once the war ended in 1945, the Airacobra faced a very different world. Thousands of aircraft had served their purpose and were suddenly obsolete, and the militaries that once needed every fighter they could find were now overwhelmed by surplus machines. The journey of the P-39 after the war is a story of repurposing, decline, abandonment, and in some rare moments, unexpected survival. When the guns fell silent, the United States Army Air Forces quickly began evaluating which aircraft were essential for peacetime operations. Jet propulsion was no longer an experiment, it was the future. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star was ready, and piston-engine fighters such as the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt were already considered transitional. In this environment, the P-39 had no place. Its mid-engine layout, tricycle landing gear, and 37mm cannon remained technically interesting, but they did not fit any strategic vision of the post-war American military. By 1946, virtually all Airacobras remaining in U.S. inventory were marked for disposal. A portion of the American stock was scrapped immediately. The process was efficient and brutal, wings were severed, engines removed, and fuselages crushed for aluminum recovery. Airfields in California, Arizona, and New Mexico became graveyards where rows of P-39s, once symbols of America's industrial might, sat waiting for the cutting torches. Some were still nearly new, with low flight hours, but the cost of storing and maintaining them outweighed their usefulness. Wartime aircraft simply had no economic justification in a world shifting toward rapid demobilization and new technologies. The situation was very different in the Soviet Union. During the war, the USSR had received more than 4,700 P-39s through Lend-Lease, making it the largest operator of the type. Soviet pilots had exploited the aircraft's strengths in ways Western pilots never fully understood. At low altitude, the Airacobra was fast, well-armed, and responsive, ideal for frontline combat over the Eastern Front. Now, however, with the war over, even the Soviets no longer saw it as a combat asset. They had gained enormous experience in aircraft design during the conflict and were pushing to develop modern fighters such as the Yak-9U, La-9, and the first generation of MiG jets. Nevertheless, the P-39 did not disappear from the Soviet skies immediately. Instead, it passed into a transitional role. Many units assigned to occupation duties, border patrol, or pilot training continued using the Airacobra for a few more years. The aircraft's ruggedness, simple maintenance, and abundant spare parts made it attractive during the uncertain years immediately after the war. Some pilots who had flown it during the conflict felt a sense of familiarity and comfort with the machine, and they welcomed its continued use. However, as early as 1947, pressure to modernize the Soviet air forces increased dramatically. The Cold War was beginning, and the Kremlin demanded jets, not relics of wartime cooperation with the United States. By 1948, the P-39 was gradually being removed from frontline or support roles, though some air districts, especially in remote regions, still flew them sporadically. In the Far East, for example, a number of Airacobras continued operating from harsh airfields where their sturdy landing gear and reliable Allison engines proved useful. But by 1950, almost all surviving Soviet P-39s had been grounded permanently. Many were cannibalized for parts to support the last flying examples, while others were stored outdoors, exposed to the elements. The Soviet aircraft decommissioning system was not designed for preservation, and most were eventually broken apart or left to rot at airfields surrounded by forests, snow, and silence. A smaller but interesting post-war chapter occurred in Europe, where a few countries briefly used the Airacobra as they rebuilt their air forces. Italy, having inherited a handful that landed on its territory during the war, performed evaluations but ultimately found no need for the aircraft in its modernizing post-war air arm. France, which had operated multiple American types, focused more on P-47s, P-63s, and Spitfires, leaving no practical role for the P-39. The Airacobra's combination of weight distribution, maintenance requirements, and wartime wear made it unappealing for nations seeking reliability above all else in their early post-war rebuilding efforts. The only significant operator outside the USSR after 1945 was Yugoslavia. During the final phases of the war, several P-39s had been captured or force-landed in Yugoslav territory, and after the conflict, the Yugoslav Air Force decided to restore a number of them. Tito's government was rebuilding its military with anything serviceable, and the Airacobra, being relatively modern and available, became part of this patchwork air fleet. Yugoslav mechanics repaired damaged airframes, repainted them, and introduced them into service. For a brief period in the late 1940s, P-39s could be seen operating alongside German, Italian, and British aircraft in one of the most diverse post-war air forces in Europe. Yet even in Yugoslavia, the aircraft service was short-lived. By 1948, the political split between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union changed the country's access to spare parts, and the P-39 quickly became difficult to maintain. Additionally, Western nations began supplying newer aircraft to Tito after the break with Stalin, making the Airacobra redundant. By 1952, the last Yugoslav examples were withdrawn, and nearly all of them were scrapped or scavenged for usable materials. Back in the United States, a handful of P-39s managed to escape destruction thanks to the emerging post-war civilian aviation market. Some private owners were fascinated by the Airacobra's unique design and bought surplus examples at extremely low prices, sometimes for as little as a few $100s. Unlike many fighters, the P-39 was relatively easy to operate from paved runways, and its tricycle landing gear made it appealing to civilian pilots who enjoyed experimental aircraft. However, the Airacobra's mid-engine configuration posed difficulties for maintenance, and the 37mm cannon, of course, had to be removed. With reduced armament and simplified systems, a few P-39s participated in air races, air shows, or experimental flight testing during the late 1940s and early 1950s. But compared to the popularity of other warbirds such as the Mustang and Corsair, the Airacobra never achieved widespread civilian fame. Its limited civilian appeal was partly due to performance. Without its wartime purpose, the P-39 did not stand out as a recreational aircraft. It was neither exceptionally fast nor particularly economical. Many surplus fighters found post-war life in Hollywood productions or air circuses, but the Airacobra lacked the iconic silhouette or combat legacy that attracted public enthusiasm. While it had been deadly in Soviet hands, its Western reputation remained tied to disappointment, and this affected its desirability. Meanwhile, in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, abandoned wartime airfields still held derelict P-39s years after the war. Some had force-landed during the conflict, others had been pushed to the edges of airstrips when newer aircraft took priority. In places like New Guinea, the Philippines, and remote islands, civilians occasionally stumbled upon decaying Airacobra wrecks long after nature had reclaimed them. Overgrown by vegetation, stripped by scavengers, or corroded by humidity, these aircraft became silent monuments to wartime operations. A few of these remote wrecks, decades later, were rediscovered by aviation historians and restoration teams, sparking renewed interest in the type. As the Cold War advanced and the memory of World War II evolved, the P-39 began to attract attention from historians who recognized its underestimated wartime importance. This shift in perception played a crucial role in preserving the small number of surviving examples. Museums in the United States, Russia, and other countries began searching for intact or restorable Airacobras. Old storage depots, rural airfields, and abandoned wartime sites became sources for recovery. Some airframes, surprisingly well preserved in dry climates like the American Southwest, were saved from complete destruction at the last moment. One of the most remarkable recoveries occurred in Siberia, where the extreme cold had preserved a crashed P-39 so effectively that it was eventually restored to airworthy condition decades later. Stories like this helped revitalize the aircraft's reputation. What had once been dismissed as an obsolete design gradually earned respect from enthusiasts who understood its historical context and how effectively it had been used on the Eastern Front. By the 1970s and 1980s, the restoration movement for warbirds was growing worldwide. The P-39, though rare, benefited from this trend. Several restored examples returned to flight, participating in airshows where crowds were intrigued by the unusual mid-engine layout and the long nose that had once housed the 37mm cannon. Pilots flying restored Airacobras described the aircraft as lively, responsive, and surprisingly stable at low and medium altitudes, the very qualities that had made it deadly in the hands of Soviet aces during the war. Today, the story of the P-39 after the Second World War is one of disappearance followed by rediscovery. From thousands produced, only a tiny fraction survives, yet those that remain serve as powerful reminders of a design that was ahead of its time in some ways and mismatched to Western expectations in others. Its post-war fate reflects a broader pattern experienced by many wartime aircraft: rapid obsolescence, mass scrapping, global scattering, and eventual resurrection through historical preservation. The gradual disappearance of the P-39 Airacobra from military inventories after the Second World War reflected not only the rapid pace of aviation technology but also the shifting political landscape that shaped global air power. As nations reoriented their priorities toward jet propulsion, long-range strategic capabilities, and post-war reconstruction, there was little practical reason to retain a single-engine fighter whose strengths had been tailored to a very different conflict. Yet the legacy of the P-39 did not end with its retirement. Instead, its story evolved into something that transcended performance charts and combat statistics. It became a story shaped by collective memory, personal experiences of pilots, the changing values of aviation preservation, and the rediscovery of forgotten airframes long after their operational days were over. In the years immediately following the war, the relatively small number of P-39s that survived intact entered a kind of historical obscurity. Unlike the P-51 Mustang, which became a cultural icon symbolizing American air superiority, or the P-47 Thunderbolt, which commanded admiration for its robustness and power, the P-39 lacked a narrative that resonated with Western audiences. Many American veterans who had flown the aircraft in the early years of the war carried memories of its limitations, especially its disappointing high-altitude performance, and these memories shaped the popular perception of the aircraft for decades. The wartime accomplishments of Soviet pilots, who used the P-39 to score hundreds of aerial victories, remained relatively unknown in the West due to political tensions of the Cold War and restricted access to archival material. As a result, the Airacobra lived in the shadows while other fighters achieved post-war fame. Despite this obscurity, the aircraft maintained a quiet but persistent presence in remote corners of the world. In the Soviet Union, airframes that had been retired were often left in remote bases where infrastructure for scrapping was limited. Remote airfields in Siberia, Central Asia, and the Far East occasionally hosted row upon row of abandoned P-39s, their paint faded, tires deflated, and engines long silent. Snow, ice, and wind eroded their surfaces, but in some cases the extreme cold preserved them better than expected. In these forgotten places, the aircraft became a kind of accidental time capsule, waiting to be discovered. Even more dramatic were the P-39 wrecks that remained in places like the forests of Russia or the swamps of the Pacific. Crashed wartime aircraft often lay untouched for decades, their remains slowly sinking into the earth or becoming overgrown by vegetation. Hunters, hikers, and villagers occasionally stumbled upon these relics. For them, the aircraft represented not only a technical artifact, but also a tangible reminder of a conflict that had reshaped the world. Over time, these discoveries drew the attention of historians, museums, and private collectors whose interest in wartime aviation had grown significantly by the 1970s. The Cold War thaw of the late 1980s and early 1990s changed everything. The dissolution of the Soviet Union opened a vast archive of previously inaccessible information about Lend-Lease aircraft, combat reports, and the experiences of Soviet pilots. For the first time, Western historians could fully appreciate the role the P-39 had played on the Eastern Front. Soviet aces such as Grigory Rechkalov, Alexander Pokryshkin, and Nikolai Gulov, among the highest-scoring Allied pilots of the entire war, had flown the Airacobra with extraordinary skill. Their diaries, interviews, and surviving records revealed how they used the aircraft's strengths in ways Western doctrines had overlooked. This rediscovered history rehabilitated the image of the P-39 and sparked new interest in preserving surviving examples. Alongside the historical reassessment came a wave of restoration efforts. Museums and private collectors, now aware of the aircraft's significance, began searching for recoverable airframes across the former Soviet Union. In remote areas of Yakutia, Kamchatka, and the Khabarovsk region, recovery teams located crashed P-39s that had remained relatively intact under layers of ice and snow. Some had sunk into wetlands but retained much of their structure. Others had landed wheels up on frozen lakes, preserving their airframes remarkably well. Salvage operations were complex and costly, requiring heavy equipment, helicopters, or winter expeditions across frozen terrain, but several successful recoveries brought the aircraft back into the spotlight. Once transported to restoration facilities in North America, Europe, or Australia, these airframes underwent painstaking repairs. Craftsmen reversed decades of neglect, corrosion, and damage to restore the fighters to their wartime appearance. Many restored P-39s were returned not only to museum display condition but to full airworthiness. Seeing an Airacobra fly again after decades of absence introduced new generations to the aircraft's unique characteristics: the sound of its Allison engine, the sleek lines of its mid-engine fuselage, and the balanced silhouette that had been so distinctive in its day. For modern pilots who have flown restored P-39s, the experience is a revelation. They consistently describe the aircraft as nimble, responsive, and pleasant to fly at low and medium altitudes. Its handling qualities, once misunderstood by early war Western pilots, now make sense in light of the tactical conditions for which it proved ideal. The absence of a supercharger limiting high-altitude performance matters little in airshows or demonstrations, and the aircraft's visibility, maneuverability, and distinctive engine placement make it a fascinating machine to operate. With the heavy 37mm cannon removed for safety and balance adjustments, the aircraft becomes even more manageable for civilian use, though restorers strive to preserve its authentic external appearance. In the museum world, the P-39 has finally earned recognition as a historically significant aircraft whose story illuminates broader themes of wartime adaptation, international cooperation, and the diversity of combat environments. Exhibits highlight how the same machine that disappointed in the tropical skies of the South Pacific became a lethal weapon in the hands of Soviet fighter regiments battling over the steppes of Eastern Europe. Visitors now learn how design choices, operational doctrine, and environmental conditions can determine the fate of an aircraft. This educational perspective has helped elevate the P-39's post-war reputation far beyond what it enjoyed in the immediate aftermath of the war. Despite the progress in preservation, the Airacobra remains one of the rarest Allied fighters of the Second World War. Many thousands were built, but only a few dozen survive in any form, and only a handful are airworthy. The combination of wartime losses, post-war scrapping, and decades of abandonment in harsh climates means that each surviving example is precious. Collectors regard the aircraft as both a technical curiosity and a symbol of the complex wartime alliances that define the global conflict. Its scarcity adds value, but its story adds meaning. Over time, the cultural legacy of the P-39 has also shifted. Among aviation enthusiasts, the aircraft has earned a reputation as an underrated performer, a fighter that achieved greatness despite being misjudged by those who expected it to behave like something it was not designed to be. This re-evaluation mirrors similar transformations in the reputations of other wartime machines whose true strengths emerged only in hindsight. The Airacobra's story is not one of failure, but of strategic mismatch, not of obsolescence, but of adaptation. Its post-war fate reflects how societies decide which machines to remember, which to forget, and which to resurrect. In the modern era, documentaries, books, and online content have helped reintroduce the P-39 to a global audience. War historians increasingly acknowledge the aircraft's essential role on the Eastern Front, while aviation enthusiasts celebrate its unusual design and combat record. Photographs of recovered wrecks, restored examples, and wartime footage circulate widely, feeding fascination with the machine's aesthetics and engineering. Virtual flight simulators have further expanded public engagement by allowing pilots around the world to experience digital recreations of the Airacobra's unique flying qualities. Through these platforms, a new generation has discovered the aircraft's story, ensuring that its memory will not fade again. Even today, occasional discoveries of P-39 wrecks continue to spark excitement. Remote expeditions sometimes uncover forgotten crash sites, their remains preserved enough to identify markings, serial numbers, or personal artifacts of the pilots who once flew them. These discoveries serve as poignant reminders of the human stories embedded in every airframe. The recovery and preservation of such wrecks is often treated not merely as a restoration project but as a historical and emotional undertaking. The remains may be studied, honored, and preserved in museums dedicated to wartime aviation, ensuring that the past remains connected to the present. The ultimate fate of the P-39 Airacobra after the Second World War reflects a pattern shared by many wartime aircraft, but with a distinctive twist shaped by politics, geography, and memory. Most were destroyed quickly, their materials recycled into the consumer goods of the booming post-war economy. Others decayed in remote regions, forgotten for decades. A few found new purpose in post-war air forces or civilian aviation, only to fade again as more advanced aircraft arrived. Yet through the efforts of historians, restorers, pilots, and enthusiasts, the P-39 eventually found a second life as a carefully preserved relic of a transformative era. Today, when a restored Airacobra flies at an airshow, the audience witnesses not only an aircraft in motion but a living connection to the complexities of global war, international cooperation, and technological evolution. The sound of its Allison engine echoes a time when the world was changing rapidly, when nations struggled for survival, and when aircraft like the P-39 played roles that were understood fully only in hindsight. Its post-war story is one of disappearance and rediscovery, loss and preservation, misunderstanding and re-evaluation. It reminds us that history often hides its most fascinating chapters in the shadows of more famous narratives, waiting for patient hands to bring them back into the light. In the end, the P-39 Airacobra survives not because it was the fastest or the most glamorous fighter of its time, but because its journey reflects the diverse and unpredictable paths that wartime machines can take once the conflict ends. It survives through the memories of the pilots who trusted it, the historians who documented it, the restorers who revived it, and the enthusiasts who continue to celebrate its unique place in aviation history. Its fate after the war may have been shaped by obsolescence, scarcity, and neglect, but its legacy endures precisely because it defies simple classification. It is a reminder that every aircraft, no matter how misunderstood or underappreciated in its day, carries a story worth telling long after the war is over.